Hi everyone. So I'd like to make an announcement. On the 3rd of May, I'm going to be doing a debate with Juan or Auburn of cognitive type. Now, cognitive type is another personality theory, one of a number of developed over recent years over the internet. And basically, he has made a starting argument for a debate. A while back, I reached out to him to try and get in touch about perhaps having some sort of debate about our respective typologies. Now, he wanted to take a few months just to prepare, to get some YouTube videos out, to build more of a presence on YouTube before the debate. But now it seemed as though he's ready because he's made an opening argument against the socionics theory, a critique of it. And so what I would like to do is just go through that with you right now, just because I think it's worth covering that first argument first, and then we can bring up other points in the actual debate, or even he can cover his response to this. So let me just go to the actual points that he made. Right. So let me just go up to the beginning. Okay, so here's what he basically said about cognitive type versus socionics. Now, to give some context, people don't know what cognitive type is. Cognitive type uses a process called Vultology. In other words, looking at the face. So in a way, it's a bit like visual identification, which I've talked about before for socionics, something which I think is intrinsically flawed because at the end of the day, you need so much data to begin to actually start seeing reliable patterns for certain faces and working out personality type from that. We've seen people in socionics try to do this in certain Russian or Ukrainian schools, and it's led to very dodgy typings. And there's often a tendency that once you see some patterns from a small sample size, you get carried away with that sample, carried away with those patterns. You start just relying on those for typing, and then you see problems later because if you're not checking, are you still following just those patterns, or are you actually checking to see if they actually are showing these aspects in their personality? If they actually do have the motivations, the thoughts, the values, preferences, strengths, and weaknesses which match up with a certain socionics type. So this is a reason why I don't tend to use visual identification actively, because I think that, yes, there may be certain patterns which show up. If you look at enough people, you'll see patterns. That does not mean that you're going to be able to rely on those patterns rather than getting to know someone, rather than talking to them, understanding their perspectives, understanding where they're coming from and what they see the world as, how they approach the world around them. That is the nub of what a personality type is, those asymmetries in how someone approaches the world. So what cognitive type does, using this Vultology approach, is understanding the face, is that they rely primarily through a form of visual identification. Juan is I think most likely an LII. I think I would say introverted logic and extroverted intuition is quite apparent from what he does, which is looking at different faces, finding certain patterns, certain commonalities, and from that building this sort of theory, which is in a way more obscure to get into some of the meanings, the definitions. They can be, they're not exactly the most relatable descriptions, but the idea is that he's put together these videos in quite a lot of work actually to pick out certain signs or signals to tell you what each kind of cognitive function looks like when someone is using them. So for instance, someone who's more extrovert intuition dominant, they'll be showing this sort of more floaty eye movements when they're thinking, when they're responding to things. But the issue is that there's been no sort of background for that. There's been no sort of empirical basis behind building that. And I'm going to explore that in a little bit just by looking through this argument. So first, let's start with Auburn's argument. Let's get into this properly. So he says this: I've been meaning to post this for a while, but as we prepare to go into a wider public audience, it will become increasingly more necessary for CT, cognitive type, to address the matter of socionics. I want to start first with the founder and then with the theory afterwards. So Ausra Augustina was the founder of socionics, and she self-typed as ILE. Yes. However, I don't think she was NETI, okay, in the cognitive type theory at least. And I think this fundamental misunderstanding of the type may have played a critical role in the way the entire socionics model is set up. Well, already we're seeing fallacy here. Just because someone is NETI in one system, it doesn't mean they're NETI in another system. So if she has worked herself out as NETI in socionics, which means certain things, that doesn't necessarily mean she is the same thing in the typology you're using, with the definitions you're using. So so what you're basically saying is, I don't think she's that type in my system, and therefore socionics is wrong by my system. It's a very solipsistic way of arguing. It's not approaching socionics on its own merits. It's looking at things from your own system because it doesn't make sense in your system. That's not a good way of arguing. It's not going to convince anyone except people who are already into the cognitive type system and see that as being the only system worth viewing things through. You're not going to reach out to other people and convince them through this particular approach. So here's what he's done. So first we can look at her Vultology in this collection of still images. So the way that he's typing her through this is go into the Vultology, which makes sense if you are a Vultologist, if that is the approach you're using. So she says, I looked everywhere, and these are only ones I found of her, these images. No video that I know of, but if someone has any, please feel free to let me know. If anyone familiar with cognitive type, right away, we can see that she has a gamma Vultology. So they've taken the ideas like socionics of alpha, beta, gamma, delta. So I think it's the same sort of ideas that if you're extroverted logic and introverted intuition, but in CT version, then you'd be a gamma. Same way we call that a gamma, or extroverted sensation, introverted ethics. And now he says, insofar as static photos can tell, the intensity of her brow, right, and the containment of her taut, square cheeks to the lower part of her face is indicative of an TENI gamma. So his version of an LIE would have these taut cheeks, in other words. And since you won't get any more footage from her, I would have to place my estimate of her type as LIE. So here's already the main point. He hasn't tried to get to understand Alsha Augustina Viciotti's actual type based on her psychology. He's just looking at the face. And he's saying, because her face is not what I think that type looks like, she's not going to be an ILE, she's going to be an LIE. And therefore, she doesn't understand the type she thinks she is, and therefore, the whole of the theory is wrong. Now, I think that's the way the argument is going. If people think I'm making a straw man, please call me out on it. But it says here, additionally, read that she was born not far from the city of Kaunas in Lithuania in 1956. She graduated from the economic faculty of Vilnius University as a financier. She worked at the Ministry of Finance of Lithuania and later as a teacher of political economics and sociology in different educational institutions in Vilnius. From a behavioral standpoint, economics, political economics, finances, and teaching all speak to high JE, so extroverted rationality, and specifically to a TE lead. This gives us 2 points of triangulation. Well, already this is, again, not something you can really rely on. Now, I guess it makes sense in the cognitive type theory, which refuses to use 8 cognitive functions. It just uses 4. It doesn't have the 8 function model which we use. And in socionics, we would say that when you have demonstrative extroverted logic, that means you're going to be showing plenty of extroverted logic, but you're also going to be showing introverted logic. There's going to be that natural balance. So what do we see here? This goes 2 points of triangulation, but perhaps the most important is the cognitive one. And this is where it gets interesting. I can imagine a lot of socionics advocates would point to Austria's theory focus and theory building as indicative of TI usage. This is not really the case, as I think socionics' view of TI is wrong, insofar as CT and socionics are both trying to measure the same thing. Now, I'm not sure why he thinks that this TI aspect is wrong. I mean, that would suggest that you'd reach some sort of radically different definition of TI. Maybe we can look into that into a bit, but it's to start off with, just for a sense of structure. This starting out by using the face typing is very similar to what we've seen with other typology theories, such as Podler, where they see certain patterns, certain signals, such as the warm wizard hands, certain ways of moving the face, moving the eyes, which is meant to be indicative of type. You can only do that in a way which is reliable if you have an independent method, an independent way of working out the type which does not use the visual. Sociologists, we have that. I get to type people via interviews. I like to talk to people, understand where they're coming from. get a sense of what their way of viewing the world is. I get to understand them. And that's how I'm able to type people. I take these different points from what they say about themselves, certain overall patterns, and I analyze that. I look for these themes, the thematic contents of what their struggles are, what the major points of interest and focus are, and I use that to type people. That's a very independent method from any visual identification method. So what I can do, I'm actually in a better position than people say in Podler ever were, and how Juan ever is, has been, in actually starting to do some sort of visual identification research. And I've had over 100 people to look at. I'd rather have more. I'd rather have like 1,600, maybe 100 people for each type. But I could start looking at what the visual patterns are and trying to put something together which is quite reliable through an independent methodology. The problem with what Juan did was he didn't have this independent methodology, not from as far as I know. He's never drawn any attention to what his independent methodology was. Maybe he did, but I haven't seen it. If he does, please call me out on that. I haven't seen it. So what we end up seeing is someone starting with trying to work out these visual patterns, almost bootstrapping from it, maybe working out some type from some sort of inconsistent methodology one way, some from another, and then very quickly, once you've found a few patterns from a small sample, can't be a big sample. How many people has he done it with? He's got this forum with a few members on it, not a huge number of members. How many different people has he looked at? What is the overall sample for each? So one, there's no sign of independent method. The sample size is very doubtful in terms of how large it is, but he's relying fully and completely now, well, almost fully and completely now, on these visual aspects and placing a major emphasis on the Vultology as the means to work out the personality type. That's very flawed. You can't, you need that independent verification. So that's a major problem with this. Like, you can't just say, oh, because I've worked out that extroverted logic, introverted types have taut cheeks, I can now look at other people who show these signs, and I know, or I'm reasonably sure they are LAs because of their taut cheeks. That's not a good way to start. At best, that's an initial clue. It's not something you can base an argument on. But the point is, you're trying to say, okay, I'm going to triangulate the fact that she did this, and also she happened to be involved in economics and finance later, which is, an LA stereotype. An ILE can do that as well, depending on the pressures of the time, depending on what she was able to do. If you need to actually make, if you're taking a focus on economics because there's a need to, or because actually interested in it from a more theoretical standpoint, you have to understand why she did this thing. People go into all sorts of careers for all sorts of different reasons. You have to understand why they went into it, why they wanted to go into it. It's the first thing I ask someone when they go into a certain role. Why did they go into that certain role? I don't just draw assumptions and conclusions from the role itself. It's a very bad way of finding out different people's type. So already you have two very doubtful pieces of evidence. One, on the tautness of the cheeks and of the brow, and based on a very sketchy and doubtful approach for working out the type visually. And I say it's sketchy and doubtful as well because when you go through these videos by Juan, they're all very intuitive. It's like, oh, any types have a sort of floaty, wandering way of using their eyes. They have a more sort of can have a more sort of elfin appearance. They can have more, whereas T is more that sort of dominant tautness and intensity. Oh, it makes a lot of sense if you just say, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. I'd imagine that type being that way. So I imagine they're physically being that way. So it has an intuition to it, an intuitive logic to it, but that's not reliable. That's not something which is going to hold up as soon as you encounter exceptions to those rules. As soon as you encounter patterns where it might not actually be that case. And if you don't have a way of checking to see if that is continuing to be the case throughout, you can't, and then these preconceived intuitions about how types ought to look like are going to fall apart. So lots of flaws there. Now, putting that together with the overall argument he's trying to make, he's using this very shaky foundation of Alstra's type being an LIE, well, an extroverted logic oriented type in CT. He's trying to suggest that based on being that's your real type, and the socionics is some sort of illusory type, because it can make sense completely in socionics. It might not make sense in CT, but he's using the fact it doesn't make sense in CT to mean it can't make sense in socionics either. It's almost assuming a predominance of one theory over another, which is yet to actually be ascertained and demonstrated. You could be one type of one system, even one type of another, and it will make complete sense in that system rather than another because of different definitions, and that's fine. He's not necessarily accepting that. He's working from this assumption and intuition that because she looks like a certain type in his theory, she can't be that type really in the other theory. The other theories just have got it wrong. So again, a bad assumption there as well. Now it says here, from a behavioral standpoint, economics, finance, and teaching will speak to high JE, yada yada. Okay, let's move on from that. So our teachings are both trying to measure the same thing, right? Now here's the next part, which I think is interesting. That why does he think that the socionics view of TI is wrong? It says Altri's theory of building is the same sort of systemization that we might see from a programmer. TE is correlated with programming. Why? What do you mean by that? From theoretical physics, also TE correlated, and mathematics. It is not the sort of philosophical inquiry into essential properties that we see from TI users in CET. This is procedural, based on laws of operation, and indeed, in this sense, socionics puts it as, here's my explanation, it's responsible for understanding logic and structure. Oh, no, here's my explanation. Logic and structure, categorizations, ordering and priorities, logical analysis and distinctions, logical explanations. L interprets information according to how it fits into a validating system, particularly aware of logical consistency and how concepts relate to each other in meaning and structure, independently of particular purposes. Except TI is not laws, he said. It's about essential ontological properties of subjects, singulars, void of procedural or causal contingencies. The above quote used to describe L is true of J, judging more generally, but leaning towards TE the most. The way Alscher went about trying to understand human nature is robotically, very much like Newton, by building a machine of computation that can describe object-object interactions. This is TE system building. Therefore, we see that Alscher's cognition, vultology, and behaviorism all match with a high TE plus NI prognosis. Now, this seems to me to be splitting hairs, because if you were to look at the way that most philosophy divides up knowledge and truth claims, we can say that there are major differences between the analytical a priori account for knowledge and the synthetic a posteriori account for knowledge. And the major difference between these two ways of forming knowledge, that one is thought out based on basic axioms. There is an aspect of deduction, of rationalism, that you take these basic principles and you work things out from there. You're not looking at the evidence, you're not looking at the data to see what actually works. You're looking at what is consistent within that. So, and that is fundamentally connected up with essential ontological properties. You work at what these essential ontological properties are, and you work at what is deduced from that, what is consistent with that. So, to try and divide those two elements into two separate things and both being thinking seems to me to be very much splitting hairs. We've shown philosophy throughout, going back to the 18th century, has made a very clear distinction. You've drawn the line right through introverted logic, I would say, rather than rightly place the line between introverted logic and extroverted logic. My reasoning being not that just because in socionics it says it that way. I'm saying it's because in philosophy, in how we've worked out these concepts, where we've worked out these important salient distinctions, that's how it works out that way. The way that socionics defines extroverted logic and introverted logic happens to align very much to these important distinctions between synthetic a posteriori on one side, that sort of logic where you are taking in evidence, you're seeing how things work and describing the real world through how things work, right? Which can be quite inconsistent, can be about lots of changing facts, empiricism, right? Versus rationalism, that synthetic a priori, analytic a priori. Statements like, for instance, a bachelor is an unmarried man. Therefore, I'm an unmarried man. Therefore, I'm a bachelor. That is actually causal and relational. You can't really have a working account of logic that isn't relational in terms of if it's analytic. The relations are what makes it actually be a thing. If you just take the essential ontological properties on their own, that is solipsistic even for introverted logic. Introverted logic is about those relationships between different points and seeing if it is consistent. That consistency is important, because otherwise, what sort of value are you placing on this? What sort of logical judgment are you making? You say about essential ontological properties of subjects and singulars. How do you know which ones are essential? How do you know which ones have ontological worth? You know that because of actually the causal aspect, the causal being the relationship of consistency. And I don't think you actually disagree, because if I look at your, if I look instead at what you've actually defined introverted logic as, let me see if I can go to that now. Let me see if I can share a different screen here. Yes. If I go here, then we can actually see you don't define it so different to us. Introverted thinking here evaluates things without the a priori of the emotional register. Okay, that's just a more of a technical thing. It's not using a priori where we're using a priori. This leaves TI without a criteria of measure outside of what is provided by the context presented. It therefore uses simple metrics such as self-contradiction, right, symmetry alignment, right. These are relationships. These are relationships between different points and whether they contradict or not, rather than comparison against an organic standard. I'm not sure what organic standard is. I might be wrong. That seems to me like looking at the comparison against how things are actually working. Maybe. How things actually work sound organic to me. This leads to a sort of ontological approach to analysis where questions like what is a table are treated from an essentialist place. The aim becomes uncovering what can rightly constitute the definition of a thing in all contexts but removed from specifics. There's an implicit axiom in the approach that assumes an essence exists and that an answer is reachable. Even if that's not what the TI user believes, information will be treated as though through some fundamental ontological answer is attainable. This is very similar to what we use for introverted logic. And the connections we have between things are very much about whether they align, they are coherent, or if they contradict, whether they work in symmetry. I think we're using the same account of TI. So how can you then say that Alsha does not understand TI if the definition of TI she's using is actually very similar to what we actually define? I can go towards our, well, certainly the definitions used for introverted logic. So if I go IM elements, perceptions, and see what we got. So, introverted logic. It's up here. No, wrong one. It's not perceptions. Sorry, guys. It's judgments. There we go. So we go to judgments. Up here, structures, axioms, underlying norms, rules that seem fundamental to it. Fundamental, that's important. Distinct elements of a set considering have qualities in common, but in membership of a set can generalize categorically. So again, not about specifics. It's about the underlying rules or principles. All propositions in a system must be consistent to all be true. So what we can see here is that those are fundamentally very similar. Right. Very similar definition there. I'm not sure exactly where the difference is. If you're talking about, say, programming, what is programming? Programming is actually structuring in terms of code. And structure is important. It's not about what is changing to work, what are just taking in lots of different facts. It's setting out the underlying structure in which something can actually turn. What makes something something, what is defined in a certain way. Programming can also be done more, multiple fixes to make things work sort of way, which can be more extroverted logic. You can't just say this is the programming way and this is extroverted logic. This is a theoretical physics way, and so that's extroverted logic. If anything, theoretical physics and experimental physics are two very different things. And why are they two very different things? Because experimental physics, one which is testing out by that organic, way of working. That's the one that's saying, well, let's put this to a test and see if this actually works. Whereas the theoretical physicists, almost theoretical cosmologists, those ones that other scientists say aren't even really scientists. They aren't doing the empirical stuff. They're more focused on working out the underlying mathematical axioms. And you say that maths is not introverted logic. What you're saying, getting to these essential properties and the relations of consistency, that is, again, introverted logic. It seems to match up exactly with what you're saying. So not only are you suggesting that you are trying to say that your version of TI is different for socionics TI. I mean, it doesn't seem to be that way. But you're also saying that the things in which TI actually manifests and seems to match your own definition, the one which you yourself have used, those is saying are also not TI. In which case, what is TI? You say it's something philosophical. Well, again, that's what mathematics is also doing. It is essential underlying rules and systems. Theoretical physics is also the more philosophical way of approaching science. That's why some scientists don't see it as being science. They prefer more experimental kind of physics. It seems as if you've drawn the line through introverted logic and almost arbitrarily cutting off what one is from another, rather than looking at what the main salient categories of logic are. And that is what philosophers throughout the centuries have said, is that analytical a priori versus the synthetic a posteriori. I think socionics lines up to that better. And using that philosophical salience of standard, I think it makes sense that we'd be more aligned to what everyone else seems to have worked out. People have seen over centuries actually working as a less than arbitrary, as a more consistent, more salient way of splitting up these different concepts in terms of how we reach knowledge and truth. So, implications and crossovers. Now, it's only said that socionics and CT are separate systems, and that socionics has its own self-consistency, which will be left to itself. But I don't think that's entirely the case. Alstra's model fails to see how definition of TI is actually a subset of expression of TE. Well, no, this is the point. We've shown that no, your definition of TI seems to be a subset over your overall definition of TI. We can show a way of TI working way which is still shown to logically follow from that sort of more essential underlying structure. But how much the use of laws in terms of underlying principles, make a discipline, a way of viewing the world, a coherent way of viewing the world. If you try to take all that stuff out of the mathematical side of that, the theoretical physics side of that, and all the applications, you strip back TI to a sort of bare bones dysfunctionality. It doesn't seem to actually be something which can actually either work or even make internally logical sense. But yes, so no, I think that actually your version TI is a subset of actual TI, and you sort of lumped all this other stuff in with TE. But the point is, you can't take the theoretical side of the theoretical physics. You can't take that theoretical axiomatic mathematics. You can't, and also the more structured coding side of programming, and say that's all TE, because then TE becomes inconsistent. You've lumped very different things together under TE. You need to really think what makes something TE. It is about, as you said, looking towards that organic standard, looking towards what is actually shown to be working, that empirical side. You can't lump in aspects of rationalism with empiricism just because you don't agree with those aspects of rationalism. It's still rationalism rather than empiricism. So that's a difficulty. And having an 8-function model, so it has a ready-made explanation of anything like this by allotting it to the other functions of the psyche. Yes, a demonstrated function. But this is itself part of a systematic problem of the model, since anomalies can also be explained as being due to the influence of the other 4 functions that are not valued. One is essentially allowed to stay in a given typing, rationalize away the gaps with no means of falsifiability. That is not true. We know exactly what elements will show up and which ones are going to be reduced. The ignoring function, for instance, is another one of those unvalued functions. But that is something which we know to be repressed by the dominant or leading function. That's important. We don't just use the ignoring function to take something away. The only time we can actually use that to actually, show this aspect to also be showing up on the unvalued part of the psyche is when we're talking about the demonstrative function. We don't do this for the others. It's only the demonstrative function, because that is the one which is allowed to work in fluid interplay with the creative function to create overall effects. So if an ILE, right, is suddenly using what seems to be a lot of introverted ethics and a lot of extrovert sensation together, we can't explain that away. We'd say, no, they can't, probably not going to be an ILE anymore. They're probably not going to be that sort of type. So we have rules. It's just that in one area, we give more slack, and that's in the demonstrative function. Just in that one area. We can't use it anywhere else. And the point is this, right? You've had to restrict the definition of introverted logic, something which doesn't seem to work at all, to then be able to pass over that Alstra is using introverted logic fundamentally in her working out of socionics, in the working out of these precise essential characteristics of each information metabolism element. So that's the very important point that seems to be looked over in this. And when it comes to my type, socionic attraction demographic. Furthermore, because of the nature of the socionics model as being very TE process oriented, Those who are attracted to it are often those who, like Alsha, have TE, who also mistake it for TI. One example in YouTuber Jackal the Aaron, thank you for the shout out. High TE user types as an ILE. Now, it's interesting. You've chosen of course, you've chosen the photos of me when I was really, really fat, which is, I don't know why I have to be doing one that I have to be when I'm fat. I've had it on the diet. I don't know why this had to be the case. It's unfortunate. I'm so sorry, everyone, to see my fat face on here like this. I apologize. But yes, we have had many high TE users come to CT from sociologists, such as TSI, Fawn, Meta, believing TI fits them, and will certainly have more due to the way it is set up to cause a skewing of types. It's not to say all people into sociology are TE users, but what I mean to say is that a lot of conceptually inclined TE users will go into sociology, see TI descriptors of them, and rationalize away any other data from the premises of the 8-function model in a self-consistent, unfalsifiable manner. No, as I said, demonstrated function is the one area that will be showing up a lot in a person. The role doesn't show up much at all. The ignoring certainly doesn't, and very much not the vulnerable. You won't see the vulnerable. We've got clear rules. We're not just arbitrarily explaining things away. It's just the demonstrated function. I'm not going to say Alsha, is going to be showing lots of introverted situations, saying, oh, that's because it's an ignoring function. It will show up a lot. No, ignoring function does not show up a lot. She's going to be deprioritizing that consistently. Introverted ethics, we won't be seeing in Alsha either, or extroverted sensation very much. So, what do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts on sociology with this, and that makes sense. It does not make sense. That's the problem. It does not make sense for the reasons which I've gone through. So, yeah, I got to get going now, but now that Juan's thrown down the gauntlet, I look forward to our debate on the 3rd of May and hope everyone can tune in to see that debate. Thank you, everyone. Bye.